It's the closest I'll ever get to church. Let's put it that way.
It's awesome. One thing I already want to just tie in here, but I just want to say Bulk of My Root is one of the best, like, even though you didn't see Bulk of My Root, I think there's something there, you know, especially for both of you, the bulk of my root, like where the work starts, the bulk of it. So even if that was a slip of the tongue, I think it was a glorious slip of the tongue, because both of you, like, I'm interested in like the root of where y'all started. And I also just love that you mentioned church, that this might be the closest you get to church and the spiritualness of it, because both you and Sadie, I'm getting familiar with your work now. I'm familiar with your work a little bit more, Sadie, music, DJing, and I know like you are post-disciplinary. Can you talk a little bit more about what you do, but also like tying in the spiritual and the church, because in conversations that I have with you in the past, you've definitely mentioned how it's also spiritual, and almost church-like, people on the dance floor, you in the booth, that kind of connection right there. You know, as Seed is talking, and I'm gonna get back to Seed too with that and how that ties in. But can you talk a little bit post-disciplinary, what that is, how that mixes in, but also the spiritual aspect of your work?
Yeah, so I've been trained in performing in visual arts growing up, and from dance to music to painting, photography, jewelry design, and all those things inform my practice now. And I think it was important for me to have those experiences, because I was able to actually put myself in them wholly and develop into other forms of work, if that makes sense. Like each discipline informs the next one. And so the work is also storytelling in respect to narrating work through articulation, through editing, and putting pieces together that may be from different time periods or from different places in the world, but are in conversation with each other. And in that way, that is where I find spirit, is through those, it speaks to lived experiences, and then it becomes its own thing once it's shared in the space with people where people are like embodying those experiences.
Ooh, I feel like this conversation is like embodiment spirituality. I think both of what it seems like y'all do almost does church better than church, or what church like achieves to. Like, talk to me a little bit more, Seed, about you said stories we tell to be well. With that, I want you to go into more of your practice and your work, and what do you mean by that? The stories we tell to be well.
Well, I think we have a shame and blame context when it comes to Black folks and our health that we have to address, and we have to deal with that kind of like head on, where we are constantly shaming and blaming us for the circumstances of our birth, the circumstances of our community, the state of our health and well-being, and even our possibilities and futures. You know, what it can be, it's all our fault. Which isn't only something that burdens us to carry, but also absolves the actors and people who are complicit in creating the systems, structures, even their behaviors themselves are just all absolved from any kind of accountability. So that has to be mitigated. That can happen on many fronts, but one of the main ways that I'm able to address it is through our narratives. How do we internalize that messaging that everything is our fault, and how does that show up in our stories? How does it show up in our self-concept? How does that show up in how we talk about ourselves and relate to others? How does that show up in our dreams or our lack of dreams? You know, our future orientation or lack of future orientation. It's all there, and I've just developed a sensitivity or hypersensitivity, maybe, Team Pisces, to hearing that in our stories. So when I say what we need to tell to be well, first it's about locating those stories that probably do not originate in us, the stories that we tell to ourselves about ourselves. There are these artifacts that are pretty clear when you key in on them and say, oh, that's not me. that's not how I thought about myself. That's me reflecting back and repeating what someone else believes about me. So we kind of uproot that and say, all right, let's separate these two things, and then we kind of recraft and rebuild our own stories without these foreign perspectives, attitudes, aesthetics, values, ways of viewing and being in the world, and just try to come back to ourselves. The other thing we do is we kind of tap into that memory, because it's not as if those things are gone. They just are often getting subdued and kind of pushed underneath the surface. And memory's deep, man. Memory itself is just a deep thing. Things we've been talking about in community for years or centuries, things like ancestral memory, blood memory, collective consciousness. These are things that science is now like catching up to. It's like, oh, there's memory in the cell, and if trauma is experienced by an ancestor, then it can express itself if it's unlocked by another experience in that individual. And now it's like, oh yeah, it's all catching up. But it's like, yeah, there are ways of knowing, and we actually inherited that. We actually know these things. Going back and doing that excavation and being able to be honest with ourselves often requires courage. And again, coming back to why we do this work in group, you've heard the term borrow courage. Lynn, courage, that's something that in group that we can do, in community we can do. We may see the muscle someone needs to build and they're a little weak there, and you can give them a spot. Right? You can help them lift something that might be too heavy for them to lift themselves. So that's the kind of support that we're able to give one another in that environment. Once we have those stories, I think for me, this is kind of like the frontier. What do we do with them? How do we activate them? You know, unlike the university where people do this work, say they come into some community, they do research, they do interviews, focus groups, all that work goes and lives on some dusty shelf, you know, or it gets published in some article that the people are never going to read or even have access to because it's in, you know, JSTORs or whatever. Or there's some intervention and the people who are involved in the intervention experience that, but then it doesn't expand beyond that moment. We can't afford to be one-off. We can't afford to just do these stories and then send the message to those communities that we came to extract and take. And Sadie, we've talked a lot about this in our practice with our work abroad, is that, you know, how are we being in relationship with communities, not just coming in as outsiders,
right,
taking what we need and then leaving. And those communities are very much aware of that dynamic. They actually anticipate it. So we're also coming in and making the argument from the beginning that this ain't that.
Well, they're like off the bat telling us that that's what we're not going to be doing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Right.
You know?
Or, you know, we'll give you the story we gave them. You know, we'll give you the story that you can Google, but you're not going to get the real. You're not going to, you know, there are layers to it, and you're not going to penetrate, you know, get to this level of the story because we hold that as sacred to us. So you really got to move differently. But yeah, I know I riffed a little bit, Sean. I hope I'm, you know, in the arena, you know.
Oh, totally. I mean, and that's what y'all do, right? You riff, like, based on what y'all do. Riffing is part of it, improvising is part of it, you know. And I want to riff a little bit too. Like, you talked about memory, and Sadie, I know you said previously